Hi there, I'm Lydia Peaver, and today on Typical Books it's a little bit of a special event because I'm going to be reading from Prelude Eve 2, a horror story called As Is, Where Is. Now, this is in support of the North Grenville Public Library, so hello to everyone that is visiting because of the author showcase. Many other authors are being featured, so I do urge you, if you're a regular viewer of Typical Books, to broaden your reading horizons at the moment and check out some of the other authors' work. As Is, Where Is a bit of a psychological tale, and if there were a genre, I would have to say that it is artifact horror or perhaps real estate horror. As Is, Where Is by Lydia Peaver. Something was making a faint noise at the front of the house, a soft sound on the steps. Maybe a bird had hit the window and flapped there with a broken wing, or some other creature needed refuge, but when Bryce concentrated and listened close, the sound stopped. He went to the front door, following a faint scrabbling, the beating of wings, but was also sure he'd heard nothing at all. It hadn't sounded like any human was there, and he wasn't expecting anyone. On the step sat a box. It had been delivered by hand without an address, so whoever had left it there must have been the apparent wounded bird. Curious things showed up in far more awkward ways over the years, so at a glance he figured the delivery must have been meant for his mother, recently deceased. With the box in the study, he hesitated opening it. There were a few chores to do, and whatever it contained may need cleaning, which was something he didn't feel up to at the moment. His stomach moved enough to let him know he'd be hungry soon. Even if it wasn't a typical day for a slice of pie, it would be nice to treat himself before becoming immersed in whatever this box contained. He'd go to the first place his mother had taken him for pie, an otherwise nondescript diner that had selections of apple, strawberry rhubarb, pecan, and lemon meringue. This was an apple pie day, if there ever was one. It started and ended with his mother's house, of course, not because it was full of her things, but things that had belonged to other dead people. Most avoided the topic and sometimes talked behind her back about it. Creepy, macabre, unsettling. While those were the words he had heard first used to describe the house, he drew a hard line between a description of her things and her as his mother. She had been none of those things, and he didn't find her strangely inherited horde creepy at all. Story after story of how people lived and what they held dear were contained therein. A golden filigree egg encrusted with jewels was just as interesting as the dented thimble beside it. Until his mother added them to her collection, that is. She never used the things, but cleaned them when needed and left them to spot the house. Clutter the house, some said. Litter the place. Bryce never thought of their house as messy, even when charged with cleaning. In and around the trinkets, underneath the dust marks that they left when lifted. Half of the things had come with the house, he was sure. Once in a while there were new additions, usually from friends. They would drop off things from acquaintances' funerals when somebody thought there was something that they ought to have. It struck him that sometimes people were deeply attached to these things, and he wondered why they didn't keep them. His mother half explained in the way that she half explained most things that it was all just too sad. It wasn't all from friends, though. Sometimes she went out and actively sought out these things that belonged to people now dead. Once he was old enough to drive, his mother had him accompany her on occasional errands, usually appointments, small shopping, some groceries that hadn't been delivered. He was nearing college age and planned on schooling abroad, so each trip became more precious. That could have been why she began to bring him on longer outings, auctions, and estate sales. He'd had a feeling they weren't going to pick up honey from the market or price firewood from a countryside lot the first time that they attended one. She wore a rather grand black dress, the sort of thing a widow would wear. The sort of thing a widow had likely worn, knowing his mother's tastes. He recalled the widow Whitmore wearing something just like it, but it fit his mother so much better. Her hat was definitely dead people's things, as it had belonged to her sister long past. Her purse and gloves from church friends, Miss Johnson and Mr. Van Dusen respectively. She tucked her glasses on, which had belonged to the town librarian at one time, and announced the destination. He'd never accompanied his mother to any excursion without a concrete plan, with no list, no order, no docket, no invoice. So this sort of unfettered outing, he could detect an air of excitement under her normally unflappable demeanor. Always sweet, calculated, and charming, his mother was made of manners. To see her exhibiting something other than carefully crafted calm was a spectacle. The way she cleared her throat, tucked errant curls back under her pillbox hat, adjusted and readjusted her glasses, and the tips of her ivory kidskin gloves created more motion in her sitting still than he'd ever seen in his life. He worried his presence was what made her what he guessed was nervous, or if she was always like this out of doors and not in the shops or market that he'd seen her at. Once they arrived, you'd think she was sending him off to school at that moment. The way she held his shoulders after straightening his hair and was already fine, and adjusted his collar that was already crisp and carried as much weight as the short, quiet sighs and soft little smiles she doled out in between. They disembarked and made their way up the grand steps of a mansion, a house twice the size of theirs. From the foyer, it seemed like a large dining hall being cleared out with rows of chairs set up for patrons of the auction and a podium set up front. No doubt brought here for the auction only. Instead of weakening, his mother's nerves reached a fever pitch. With the bidding in full swing, what may have appeared as calm and collected to others became a whirling dervish in the chair next to him. She changed positions frequently, fanned herself with her numbered paddle that she'd raise and lower tentatively, then turned to giggle at Bryce as if they'd done something naughty and that he, her co-conspirator, needed to nod and smirk back. He sat doe-eyed and quiet, barely able to concentrate through the buzz around him. They were surrounded by hyenas in comparison, cackling, cruel, and raucous, possessed masses. Instead of the auction, he'd envisioned being a staid and quiet affair, not unlike a funeral for someone most people hadn't liked very much. This was more boisterous than an Irish wake. When it was all over, they went out for a slice of pie and cheese. Sweets being a rarity, he wasn't sure if this was his mother's way of apologizing or a way of coming down with a rush of sugar, unlike whatever adrenaline she'd felt there. Bryce felt nothing aside from vague curiosity. Where his mother frothed over, picking at the meringue on her tart, he felt as plain and settled as the half-nibbled dart of cheese on his plate. By the end of the day, she'd walked out of that estate with a tartan kilt, a felt witch with a face carved from a dried apple, and 3 antique spoons. He hadn't paid attention to what they'd cost, and seemed that she hadn't either. When they arrived home, the new additions were placed only semi-ceremoniously with similar items in the house that Bryce marveled briefly at how it seems that items, as random as they felt on the trip home, seemed to belong once they got in the door. As if they'd always been there. More things that once belonged to unknown dead people. She died not long after they'd gone to a few more sales, quieter ones, auctions that were much more like what he'd originally envisioned, but always pie afterward. He knew right away her excitement on the first day had really been for him. She was pleased to have him along, so much it had popped a strange balloon of silence that commonly surrounded her. In his mind, the subsequent journeys out were much more enjoyable. Her death, however, was not. If only for the amount of people in and out of the house and the noise and paperwork, platitudes and paper plates of pastry in every hand. Her actual death itself was sweet and quiet, as she was and as she liked it, in her sleep and quite sudden. It would have seemed planned, as the day before she'd given a sudden tour of the cleaning supplies, tonics, and abrasives that she used to care for her antiques. They'd only just returned from visiting old church friends. Of course it was to pay condolences. It was his mother, after all. After sipping coffee and enjoying some dry cake as best they could, the son and the mother of the deceased sent Bryce and his mother off with war memorabilia. A hardcover parachutist manual, and the strangest of all, a false tooth. Apparently, Mr. Gore had kept it since returning from war to marry, so it was important to his widow as an engagement ring. Mother did have a few prostheses and medical items. The tooth would go between the false foot, made of wood, and the flaking rubber bulb attached to what she said was a breast pump, although he always thought it was a strange trumpet when he was small. The medals, though, would go with the others. She had an impressive clutch of medals displayed in small frames dotting nearly every wall of the house. They all had very gentle cleaning so as to not damage or degrade the medal, but to have them shine if at all possible. Some people kept their awards pristine, but some had certainly been forgotten and dulled with age. These she would dip into elixirs and buff with certain cloths from time to time. For the first time, she wanted him privy to the cleaning. This tooth was special indeed. It was a small contraption built to secret a cyanide caplet inside the mouth of a general. Upon capture, he would bite down in a peculiar way, poison himself, and not only protect any information that may have been tortured out of him, but avoid that unpleasantness of death altogether. When asked how she learned to care for the collection, if he were ever charged with the same, she motioned to a small shelf of books in the broom closet. Books that had been left in the house when she and her father, the father he barely remembered, had moved in. These were dead people's things, taking care of future dead people's things. As with anything in the house, he learned each item led to another, and in a way, they all led to these books. How he'd never noticed the broom closet before only slightly surprised him. Since he'd let himself be astounded by all he's never noticed in the house, he'd need to exist in a permanent state of stun. He occupied himself, getting acquainted with his strangely inherited collection. His mother's things. All the things in the house that had belonged to other people who were also dead. It offered a certain closeness. Had he or she ever thought to turn down an item? Surely not. What about the method? At auction or estate sale? It was much the same as figuring out what piece belonged where in the house. You sat there until something that simply belonged came along. And then it did. It was about a month before he ventured out on his own. Bryce had wanted to start small, and just attended one estate sale to see how he felt. Soon it was twice a week, and that felt normal. Items found him, and he welcomed them. It was a pastime as much as he thought of his mother when it was her pastime. Then he awoke one day with the most incredible urge to find something. He wasn't sure what. He looked in the mirror, and his eyes were alight, uncanny. He looked so much like his mother had in her last month, a spring in his step, chatty and spry. At first he thought it may be pent-up excitement from the 2 unopened letters that sat on the hall table, both of them from respected universities he'd applied to. Reluctant to read them, he bet on the strange urge to go out on the day instead of poring over his future plans. Future plans he neglected. He only wished there was someone to take along with him. He felt the crazed notion that there was a particular thing out there seeking him, and he'd not lose its beacon until it was found. Was that how she felt until that final day? When he did find the tooth behind the wooden foot, the cyanide capsule was missing. This did not taint his picture of her final hours, but it did have him wonder exactly how his father had tripped over the balustrade. Perhaps they'd both made grave decisions on their own to spite the Reaper. Hers certainly was a very sudden death, but for a week leading up to, she seemed much like Bryce felt now. Tripping over his own feet in the morning to greet the day, scouring the newspaper for sales, and slyly skimming the obituaries, much like she had over morning tea. He'd had an inkling there was something that she was after, maybe finally collecting instead of passively welcoming stuff like birds to a feeder. Out there somewhere was a songbird in a cage, and it was singing all day for him. She must have heard one too all that time. A few days later, his songbird stopped. The box had arrived, and this must have been it. That thing destined to satisfy the indescribable yet incredible urge to add to the collection, to build the walls of the house up with dead people's things. When the rooms were dark and the desk lamp glowed amber, Bryce returned with a letter opener that had most likely belonged to his father. Once the tape was sliced, the 4 top closures parted to reveal shredded newspaper swaddling a hinged wooden box that he could not identify right away. The weight of the box gave him a clue as to what was inside. Once opened on its shiny oiled hinges, he was not surprised to find the gun. It was an Enfield top-break revolver, and though he knew so little about guns that he guessed at that from the name on the box and the placement of bolts alone, he had no idea how to check if it were loaded or if it would work. It smelled of oil and old fire. When he placed it to his temple, he only hoped it would go off when he pulled the trigger. And it did. Sweetie, this entire house is full of dead people's things. Oh, I know, isn't it lovely? No, it's not being lovely, it's a mess. It'll take us a year to clean this place out. As is, where is my love? As is my ass. You really want to dig through all this? I can get a trash. No way. It gives the place character. Besides, I'm sure I could find one or two things in all this that would make all the digging worth it. Yeah, it'll take 2 years then. Like, what even is half of this stuff? He was standing cross-armed next to one of the many shelves cluttered with dusty, drab artifacts. That's an antique breast pump. Garbage. Treasure. Clutter, he smiled, eyes glinting at his bride, even mid-argument. The house, our house, and all it contains, she said in a sing-song. And all its trash. All the wonderful things. All the dead people's things. With eyes that stared miles past her groom and a smile that showed only a hint of mirth, the house replied through those maiden lips. And soon all our things will be here too. That was As Is Where Is by Lydia Piefer from Pray Light Eve 2. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed. Have an ooky, spooky day.